The day began like any other, quiet, uneventful, the kind of morning where the sun feels more like a friend than a burden. The birds chirped across the rooftops, neighbors hustled out of their driveways on the way to work, and I sipped my coffee while admiring the one piece of property I took the most pride in, my front lawn. It wasn't perfect, not in the glossy magazine cover sense that some people seem to obsess over, but it was mine. The grass was trimmed, though not like the golf course green that the HOA worshipped. A few patches of dry brown lingered near the sidewalk, a scar from last summer's heat. Still, it was healthy, full, and vibrant enough that I never imagined anyone could call it a problem. But I was wrong. By mid-morning, when I stepped out to check the mailbox, the ordinary rhythm of the day collapsed. Tucked beneath the metal flap was an envelope marked in bold red ink, "Notice of Violation." At first glance, I assumed it was some minor reminder, something trivial like recycling bins left out too long. But as I unfolded the letter, my stomach sank. The HOA wasn't just asking for compliance, they were demanding money. $10,000, they claimed, was the fine for having non-uniform lawn maintenance and failure to uphold neighborhood standards. $10,000 for grass. The words swam in front of me. They described my lawn as unsightly and detrimental to neighborhood value, terms so exaggerated that they bordered on parody. According to them, I had 30 days to pay or face escalating penalties, including liens against my property. My morning coffee turned bitter in my throat as I read it again, searching for a loophole, a mistake, anything that could explain how such absurdity could exist. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the message. This was a declaration of war from the HOA board, a group already infamous in the neighborhood for their pettiness, their rigid obsession with rules, and their willingness to target anyone who didn't bow down to their authority. I had seen others fall victim before. Neighbors who repainted their houses 3 times in a single year, families who paid thousands for invisible violations until they quietly sold and left. Now, the board had chosen me. As the hours passed, the initial shock gave way to anger. My lawn wasn't a problem, and even if it were, no reasonable system would demand $10,000 for grass. It was extortion dressed in legal language. A flex of power meant to intimidate me into submission. They thought I would fold, like so many others had. But they underestimated the one thing I had in abundance: patience, and a burning sense of revenge. That night, I walked across my lawn under the dim glow of the streetlights. The grass brushed against my ankles, whispering with each step, as if urging me not to give in. I stared at the neighboring houses, the pristine, chemically treated carpets of green that looked more like artificial turf than nature. They might have met the HOA's ridiculous standards, but they were lifeless. Uniformity disguised as beauty. I realized then what the HOA feared most: individuality. They wanted control. A neighborhood where every house was a clone of the next, where creativity was suffocated under rules. My lawn wasn't perfect, but it was mine. And that, to them, was the true violation. The letter still sat on my kitchen counter, its bold red ink taunting me. But as midnight crept over the neighborhood, a plan began to form in my mind. If the HOA thought my lawn was a problem, I would show them what a real problem looked like. Not by fighting their fines, not by begging for mercy, but by transforming my grass into something that would haunt their every meeting, their every clipboard inspection, their every smug smile. The lawn they hated so much was about to become their worst nightmare. And this was only the beginning. The plan didn't arrive as a single lightning bolt. It arrived as a dozen small, furious sparks. Each spark was an idea. A small rebellion that, when stitched together, formed a tapestry of mischief so meticulously engineered that it would leave the HOA reeling. I spread the violation notice across the kitchen table and began to entertain possibilities: practical, legal, theatrical. The less conventional they were, the more they appealed to me. This wasn't a moment for petty compliance. It was an opportunity for spectacle. First, reconnaissance. I walked the neighborhood with the quiet determination of someone learning the terrain of a battlefield. I observed the HOA's rituals: who drove the golf cart with the US Inspector badge, which house always had the most flags, whose porch light never flickered off. I cataloged times when the lawn patrols were lax and when the board members gathered in solemn clusters to gossip behind hedges. Information was a weapon, and I intended to use it. My lawn would not simply be altered, it would be weaponized. I sketched layouts on a pad: curves and pathways, islands of texture, patches of wildflowers that mocked the manicured sameness of the other yards. I imagined a riot of colors, not a single shade of contrived green. I envisioned native plants that sang to bees and butterflies, tall grasses that swayed like a flag of defiance. I pictured a labyrinth of symbolism, a mosaic of stones, a winding gravel path that led to nowhere yet implied purpose, and, tucked near the mailbox, a small plaque that read, "Nothing at all, silence as a statement." Legal boundaries had to be respected, if only because violating them would give the HOA unquestionable ammunition. I pored over the community guidelines until the ink blurred, searching for the exact line they claimed I crossed. There were clauses written in the kind of vocabulary designed to terrify ordinary people: aesthetic standards, curb appeal, community integrity. But remarkably, there was no law that forbade eccentricity, no statute that outlawed drought-tolerant landscaping, no penalty explicitly levied for being different. The fine, the $10,000 specter, was a threat, a bullying tactic wrapped in committee minutes and stamp-sealed letters. That was the crack I needed. If the board could not justify a $10,000 fine within the bare language of the rules, then their coercion was an empty roar. But proving that would take time, and time is a luxury when momentum is on your side. The next step would be rapid, visual, unavoidable change. My design had to be aggressive enough to provoke, yet clever enough to evade their precise legal clause. I began collecting materials: old bricks from a neighbor's renovation sale, cheap solar lights that blinked like the eyes of 1,000 tiny policemen, and a pallet of drought-resistant wildflowers ordered online under an alias for anonymity. I bought a used signpost, not to announce a sale or a lost dog, but to host a rotating display. Each week the display would change. One week a cluster of hand-painted stones, the next a row of whimsical recycled art. It would be a living exhibit that refused to be boxed into their checklist of conformity. Night work became my method. When the neighborhood quieted and the streetlights hummed, I worked beneath the soft glow, laying the first lines of the new design. I dug with a measured fury, uprooting small squares of sod and replacing them with native ground cover that looked like a wild, deliberate accident. I planted clumps of lavender near the walkway so that when the air warmed, the scent would flood the approach to my house like an unapologetic perfume. It was important that the transformation look purposeful yet organic, like a person who had simply chosen to live differently, not someone staging a performance. The first morning after the initial alterations, I watched from the kitchen window as a board member ES minivan slowed in front of my house. The driver, always impeccably coiffed, leaned forward, peering as if trying to read the shape of the rebellion. I poured coffee, not because I needed warmth, but because ritual steadied me. The board member wrote something into a clipboard and drove away with the precise expression of someone who believes we've seen a problem that must soon be corrected. The game had begun. Word moved faster than I had imagined. Neighbors who had been quietly sympathetic now whispered at fences. Some raised eyebrows, others raised hands in clandestine approval. The older couple across the street left a small ceramic bird on my mailbox, an offering of solidarity, I decided, while a mother down the block pushed her stroller by a little slower, pointing to the riotous color and smiling at her toddler. The lawn that had once been merely mine now functioned as a signal flare, bold, public, impossible to ignore. The HOA did not wait long. The violation letter had already taught them that intimidation worked, and they would try it again. A knock at my door came in the late afternoon. Not one voice, but a delegation, 2 board members, a clipboard, and the smug moral superiority of people who police beauty like it is a crime. They inspected my alterations with the gravitas of coroners. Their notes were detailed in that way people are when they believe themselves guardians of taste. They circled words on their clipboard, exchanged looks, and left with an ultimatum. Restore the lawn to its original, acceptable state or face disciplinary action. They failed to see, or perhaps refused to accept, that I had already decided this would be a long campaign. I documented everything: photos, timestamps, the names of people who had visited, the sequence of the plants as they took root. Evidence, I thought, was like a ledger. It kept a careful account of truth against the tendentiousness of the board. I started a private folder on my laptop, call it my dossier, and fed it daily. If this became a legal war, I would not be the unprepared defendant. I would be the architect. The HOA's first formal notice after my changes was predictably pompous. It cited vague concerns about uniformity and neighborhood character, phrases that had no teeth when pressed against the reality of my careful, eco-friendly plant choices. I sent them a copy of the community guidelines with marked passages and highlighted contradictions. I did not write them an angry letter. Had I done that, They would have written me one back and framed it. Instead, I compiled facts, dates, and images. I wrote nothing inflammatory. The mildness was intentional. It created a contrast between my rational, documented defense and their theater of outrage. That contrast, I realized, was a strategic advantage. People remember extremes more than they remember dull consistency. The more the HOA performed outrage, the more my community would witness the pettiness. Every meeting where they aired grievances about my lawn became a piece of theater that revealed them as the antagonists. I started to imagine their weekly gatherings, clipboards, casseroles, and a slow-burning obsession with lawn heights. It was a grotesque caricature of bureaucracy, and I planned to illuminate it with the public's attention. I also began quietly recruiting unlikely allies. A landscaper who loved native plants and hated chemical gardens, a retired lawyer who had grown weary of small-town bullies, and a high school art student who wanted to build a sculpture from recycled metal for extra credit. Each brought a resource, a skill, a person to stand with me when the board rallied its forces. My resistance would be a coalition, not a lone homeowner screaming at a committee, but a collective push that challenged the idea that conformity was synonymous with community. The next phase would escalate the visual rhetoric. My lawn would not only be unorthodox, it would be performative in a way that was undeniably legal. It would force the neighborhood to reckon with the question the HOA feared most. Who gets to decide what beauty looks like? But as the sun set on the second week and solar lights blinked to life along the newly defined paths, another thought crept up. What if the board tried harder? What if they pushed past letters and into the realm of liens and legal threats? I balanced the thrill of the uprising with the practical knowledge that victory would require endurance. Still, as darkness gathered and the lavender's scent rose on the cool air, I felt something like certainty. The lawn would not be restored on the HOA's timetable. It would evolve under my watch, an organism of rebellion that would either survive their attacks or make them grotesquely publicly reveal themselves as the true eyesores. I had chosen escalation with intention. I had chosen spectacle with restraint. And I had begun to create the sort of stubborn, beautiful problem that could not be easily categorized or summed up on a clipboard. The groundwork was laid, both literally and figuratively. The first stones were set, the list of allies compiled, the documentation begun. The next moves would require daring I hadn't yet used and creativity that might push the bounds of neighborly patience. I slept that night with dirt under my nails and a smile somewhere between exhaustion and triumph, knowing the board would not rest, and that I did not intend to either. The lawn was no longer a patch of grass. It had become a stage. Each day brought new layers, new shapes, and new symbols until the property began resembling less a suburban yard and more a living gallery that drew stares from every car that passed. The board had demanded uniformity, but in my rebellion I had birthed something far more powerful: curiosity. Neighbors began to stop on their evening walks, no longer hurrying past but pausing, studying, and whispering. The lavender bushes bloomed into purple clouds that carried their scent down the street. The gravel paths wound into patterns that suggested deliberate design, not negligence. Solar lights marked borders in strange geometric formations, twinkling like constellations when night fell. Children lingered at the edge of my property, fascinated by the maze-like shapes, their parents torn between disapproval and intrigue. The HOA had counted on isolation, on me being shunned into submission, but what unfolded was the opposite. People were drawn to the defiance, the creativity. They saw in my yard something they themselves had long been denied: freedom in a neighborhood suffocated by sameness. What began as whispers grew into conversations. Some neighbors admitted quietly that they too hated the endless fertilizer schedules and water bills that came with maintaining their perfect lawns. Others simply admired the audacity of standing against the board. By the second week, a photograph of my lawn appeared on a community Facebook page. The caption was predictably divisive. Some praised the originality, calling it refreshing in a neighborhood where every house looked cloned. Others, clearly aligned with the board, decried it as a disgrace and threat to property values. But the photo was shared beyond the community, picked up by local gardening groups and design enthusiasts. My lawn was no longer just mine. It was entering the bloodstream of public opinion. The HOA noticed. Their next letter arrived stamped with urgency, accusing me not only of non-compliance but of creating a public nuisance. The irony was almost comical. They had turned a backyard squabble into a stage for the whole town. They demanded immediate restoration to acceptable standards or the beginning of serious legal action. But the threat only revealed their desperation. They were losing the narrative and the board knew it. I escalated. Where once there had been lavender and gravel, I added color. A wildflower section erupted near the mailbox, tall enough to sway like a field in miniature. I arranged reclaimed bricks into a spiral pattern in the center of the yard, a design visible from the street, its curves mocking the rigid rectangular lawns around it. The high school art student installed a small recycled metal sculpture near the edge of the property, a piece abstract enough to resist easy criticism but bold enough to draw attention. It caught the sunlight and cast fractured shadows across the grass at sunset. By the end of the third week, my lawn had transformed into something unmistakable. It was neither yard nor garden but statement. And with each transformation, the HOA's grip slipped further. The board responded with theater. At their next meeting, held in the cramped clubhouse at the edge of the development, they made my lawn the central topic. I knew this because sympathetic neighbors told me everything. They described the board's frustration as they waved photos and spat words like eyesore and threat. They debated fines, liens, even the possibility of taking me to court. But their anger was undercut by a problem they hadn't anticipated. People were beginning to take my side. An elderly neighbor stood up at that very meeting and asked the question they feared most. Why was diversity of landscaping such a threat? If a yard could be beautiful without being uniform, why was that not celebrated? The board dismissed her concerns, but the seed had been planted. Meanwhile, local media had caught wind of the story. A small online outlet published a short article about the lawn controversy dividing a suburban HOA. It was a piece meant to entertain, but it carried weight. A photo of my spiral brick pattern accompanied the article, and in the comments, strangers from outside the community voiced support, mocking the board's obsession with conformity. The HOA's attempt to keep everything insular had backfired. My lawn had become a symbol of resistance, amplified beyond the subdivision. The pressure on the board grew heavier. Their next move was clumsy. They sent inspectors not once a week but every other day, patrolling like soldiers in enemy territory. Clipboards in hand, they crouched, measured, scribbled, and scowled. Their presence, meant to intimidate, only added fuel to the fire. Neighbors recorded them on phones, uploading the footage with mocking captions. The inspectors became caricatures of themselves, bureaucrats bending over flower beds while the internet laughed. Yet beneath the humor, tension simmered. For all their incompetence, the HOA still had legal weapons. They could escalate fines, seek liens, even attempt foreclosure if the conflict dragged long enough. Their desperation could make them reckless, and reckless opponents were dangerous. So I fortified. Every change to my lawn was documented with receipts, photographs, and time-stamped logs. Every plant was a native species, legal under state law and defensible under environmental regulations. Every brick and solar light was carefully placed within property boundaries. My rebellion was not chaos. It was structure hidden inside apparent disorder. And in that structure, I found confidence. But the board was not retreating. At their next closed-door session, they began drafting a lawsuit, citing vague terms of neighborhood degradation and community impact. I learned of it through the retired lawyer who had joined my side. He warned me that they might attempt to overwhelm me with legal costs, regardless of the weakness of their case. They didn't need to win outright, they only needed to exhaust me. I lay awake that night staring at the ceiling, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the house. The thrill of rebellion gave way to the sobering reality of escalation. What had begun as a personal stand was now a battle with consequences that could stretch into months, even years. Yet beneath the anxiety, a strange calm settled. The lawn was no longer about me. It was about everyone who had ever been silenced, fined, or driven out by the HOA's petty tyranny. I thought of the elderly neighbor who spoke up, of the couple who had left a ceramic bird on my mailbox, of the strangers online rallying behind the cause. The board thought they had cornered one homeowner, but in truth, they had awakened something far more dangerous. A movement. As dawn broke, painting the sky in pale pinks and blues, I stepped onto the porch and looked over the spirals, the flowers, the lights still glowing faintly against the fading night. The lawn was alive, a living declaration that the board's authority had limits. The HOA was preparing their most aggressive counterattack, but I was ready. What they did not realize was that every strike they made only tightened the noose around their own credibility. They had declared war over grass, and soon the whole town would see just how absurd and how corrupt they truly were. The neighborhood had awakened, and the battle for its soul was just beginning. The HOA had been humiliated in whispers, mocked in quiet corners, and criticized on community forums. But humiliation alone rarely causes tyrants to surrender. Instead, it hardens them. The board, once content to hide behind stern letters and clipboard patrols, decided it was time to escalate. And when they escalated, they did so with all the self-importance of a small-town monarchy fighting for its crown. The first blow came not with a knock on my door, but with a courier envelope stamped in heavy official ink. Inside was the threat I had been expecting, a formal notice of intent to pursue legal action. Their claim was couched in lofty, menacing phrases: property devaluation, detrimental precedent, violation of contractual obligation. It was a collection of abstract accusations, more thunder than lightning, but it carried weight nonetheless. They were preparing to drag me into court, to bleed me through legal fees, and to display me as an example for anyone else daring to question their authority. The sum they demanded was grotesque: immediate restoration of the lawn to acceptable standards, payment of the $10,000 fine, and reimbursement of administrative costs. The board assumed I would fold under the pressure, that the sight of legal letterhead would break my resolve. They had mistaken me for someone who played defense. The lawyer who had quietly allied himself with me pored over the document and smirked at its weaknesses. The HOA had overreached. Their language was vague, their demands inconsistent with their own guidelines, and their reliance on subjective standards made them vulnerable. They had thrown a spear, but in their rage, they hadn't noticed how flimsy it was. The lawyer began drafting a response, not only to dismantle their claims, but to warn them of countersuits should they persist. At the same time, the narrative of the lawn continued to grow beyond the neighborhood. The local news station aired a short segment titled, "Homeowner Faces $10,000 Fine Over Lawn Design." They interviewed neighbors on both sides. Some parroted the board's rhetoric about property values, but others, more than the HOA expected, spoke of freedom, individuality, and the absurdity of weaponizing grass. Cameras lingered on the spirals of brick, the blooms of lavender, the whimsical sculpture catching sunlight. In living rooms across town, people saw not an eyesore but a story of defiance. The HOA board members could not control the media. Their letters and ultimatums had been designed to intimidate in silence, not withstand the glare of public attention. Now, instead of authority, they looked like bullies. And bullies who fear exposure become reckless. Their next retaliation was theatrical in its absurdity. The board hired a landscaping company, without my consent, to stand outside my property with measuring tape and cameras. They shouted at passers-by that my lawn was illegal and claimed they were documenting violations for court. Neighbors watched with disgust. Someone filmed the scene and uploaded it to social media. Within hours, the video spread with captions mocking the HOA's theatrics. Comments poured in, ridiculing their obsession. The clip transformed them from bureaucrats into memes. Still, ridicule was not victory. The lawsuit loomed, and lawsuits are not won by popularity but by precision. I doubled down on documentation, creating folders filled with evidence. Receipts proving the plants were native, expert notes confirming the environmental benefits of drought-tolerant landscaping, photos time-stamped at every stage of the lawn's evolution. The lawyer helped me compile everything into a package of counter-arguments, ready to crush their flimsy case the moment it hit court. But it wasn't enough to defend. Defense made me reactive, and reactive people are easy targets. I needed to attack, not with slander or aggression, but with exposure. If the board wanted to wield the law, I would wield the spotlight. I reached out to the journalist who had written the first article, offering detailed records of the HOA's overreach. I shared testimonies from neighbors who had suffered similar harassment. Families fined for flower pots, retirees forced to repaint their fences multiple times in a year, young couples driven into debt by frivolous penalties. The story was no longer about my lawn. It was about a pattern of abuse. The journalist recognized the larger narrative, and soon a follow-up article appeared with a headline that made the board seethe. HOA accused of targeting homeowners with excessive fines. The board's carefully constructed image cracked. What had once been a local authority now looked like a petty dictatorship. Members of the community who had stayed silent began to whisper louder. Some even wrote anonymous letters, slipped into my mailbox, thanking me for standing up because they never could. The board's intimidation had relied on silence, but I had replaced silence with noise, and that noise was growing louder. Yet, for every inch of ground I gained, the board fought harder. They announced an emergency meeting, summoning the neighborhood to discuss the threat posed by non-compliant lawns. The wording was almost apocalyptic. They painted my yard not as a garden but as a contagion that would infect the community. Their paranoia was palpable, but paranoia can be contagious too. I knew the meeting would be their chance to sway undecided neighbors with fear. I prepared for it as one prepares for battle. I gathered my allies, the lawyer, the landscaper, the elderly neighbor who had dared speak up, and even the high school student whose sculpture now stood as a metallic sentinel in my yard. Together we compiled visuals, reports, and testimonies. If the board wanted a spectacle, I would give them one they could not contain. The night of the meeting, the clubhouse buzzed with tension. The board sat at the front, puffed up with authority, clipboards stacked like shields. Neighbors filled the seats, some loyal, some skeptical, many curious. They expected to see me cornered, defensive. Instead, I arrived prepared, my folder of evidence clutched like a weapon. The board opened with fire, parading photos of my lawn as though displaying evidence of a crime. They spoke of declining property values, community standards, and dangerous precedent. Their words dripped with panic disguised as professionalism. And then, it was my turn. I stood before the crowd and presented not rage but facts. I spoke of native plants reducing water waste, of wildflowers attracting pollinators, of design choices rooted in legality. I revealed the documentation of every receipt, every timestamp, every clause in the guidelines that contradicted their claims. I did not shout. I let the weight of truth crush their bluster. And when I unveiled the testimonies of other harassed neighbors, murmurs rippled through the crowd. The HOA had thought they were trying me. Instead, I was putting them on trial. By the time the meeting adjourned, the board was visibly shaken. Their once iron grip on the neighborhood had slipped, and they knew it. Their lawsuit was still on the horizon, but the tide of public opinion had shifted, and with it, their ability to act unchecked. I walked home that night under the glow of streetlights, the murmurs of neighbors following me like echoes. My lawn gleamed in the moonlight, alive with defiance. The board would not retreat quietly. They would strike harder, dig deeper. But the balance of power had shifted. They had tried to bury me with fines and threats. Instead, they had planted the seeds of their own downfall. The HOA's pride could not survive humiliation. Their authority had been shaken at the emergency meeting, their carefully manicured image torn apart by facts and testimonies they could not silence. But tyrants rarely surrender when cornered. Instead, they lash out, clawing for whatever scraps of power remain. True to form, the board pressed forward with their lawsuit. The summons arrived in a thick packet delivered by a stone-faced process server. Within its pages, the accusations unfolded like a parody of legal seriousness. Failure to maintain uniform aesthetic standards. Deliberate disregard for neighborhood harmony. Willful damage to property values. They demanded not only the $10,000 fine but also legal fees and compensatory damages for the supposed harm caused by my rebellion. It was absurd, but absurdity backed by a courtroom is dangerous. The board believed the sheer weight of litigation would exhaust me, that the stress, the mounting fees, the months of entanglement would break my will. But what they didn't understand was that I had been preparing for this moment since the first letter appeared on my door. Every photo, every receipt, every timestamp had been collected not just for defense but for war. The weeks leading to the hearing were grueling. Depositions, paperwork, endless consultations with my lawyer. The board showed up with smug certainty, each member armed with binders of evidence. Their binders were filled with glossy photos of my yard, enlarged and captioned like exhibits in a museum of outrage. They even hired an expert witness, a landscaper who insisted my yard was objectively detrimental to community value. But when pressed, his credentials were shaky, his statements dripping with bias. He was more cheerleader than expert. My lawyer, in contrast, presented a strategy sharp as glass. We compiled environmental reports showing the benefits of native plants, expert opinions praising drought-resistant landscaping, and written testimony from neighbors who valued the individuality my lawn brought to the block. Even the high school art student submitted a statement about the sculpture project, emphasizing community engagement. Every piece of evidence turned the board's thunder into hollow noise. When the day of the hearing arrived, the courthouse buzzed with quiet anticipation. Word had spread. And though this was not a criminal trial or a case of national importance, the gallery filled with curious neighbors, reporters, and even strangers who had followed the saga online. What had begun as a personal dispute had transformed into a public spectacle. The board's attorney opened with fire, painting me as a selfish homeowner whose disregard for rules threatened the very fabric of the neighborhood. He waved photos of the spiral brick pattern, sneered at the wildflowers, and dramatized the solar lights as though they were instruments of chaos. His performance was sharp, but the substance was thin. Then it was my turn. My lawyer spoke with precision, cutting through their rhetoric with the calm force of undeniable facts. He highlighted the vagueness of the HOA's guidelines, the lack of any specific prohibition against my landscaping choices, and the environmental benefits documented by experts. He presented my meticulous records, receipts, photographs, logs, proof that every change was intentional, legal, and beneficial. But it was not the evidence alone that shifted the tide. It was the testimony of the neighbors. The elderly woman who had spoken at the meeting stood in court, her voice trembling but firm, describing how the HOA had harassed her for years over trivial matters. Another neighbor testified about repainting his fence 3 times in 2 years under threat of fines. The gallery murmured with each revelation. Piece by piece, the narrative turned against the board. The climax came when the video of the HOA's inspectors measuring my yard was played in court. Their theatrical posturing, captured and mocked online, drew muffled laughter from the gallery. Even the judge's expression betrayed disbelief. The image of self-important board members bending over flower beds with tape measures shattered any illusion of dignity they still possessed. By the time closing arguments were made, the outcome felt inevitable. The HOA had arrived expecting to crush me under their authority, but instead, they stood exposed as bullies. The judge delivered his decision with crisp finality. The HOA's claims were dismissed, their fine invalid, their attempt to demand damages rejected outright. He even warned them that pursuing frivolous litigation in the future could result in penalties against them. The gallery erupted in whispers, then applause, quickly silenced by the bailiff but impossible to suppress entirely. Reporters scribbled notes, neighbors exchanged triumphant glances, and the board members sat pale, their faces twisted in quiet defeat. For the first time, their power had been checked, not by whispers or defiance, but by law itself. As I stepped out of the courthouse, the sunlight felt different, warmer, freer. Cameras clicked, microphones thrust forward, reporters hungry for sound bites. I gave none. My silence said more than words. I had won, not just for myself, but for everyone who had been trampled under the weight of arbitrary rules. But victories are not endings. The board would not dissolve overnight. Pride is a stubborn poison, and theirs still flowed. Though they had lost in court, I knew they would seek another way to reclaim their dominance. A cornered tyrant is dangerous, and their desperation could drive them to acts of pettiness beyond imagination. Defeat never sits well with tyrants. The HOA board, humiliated in court and mocked online, did not fade into silence as many had hoped. Instead, they retreated into bitterness, regrouping like generals after a lost battle, desperate to salvage their power. I could feel it in the way their cars lingered a little too long in front of my house, in the way certain members stared from across the street with narrowed eyes. Their authority had slipped, but their pride demanded one last strike. The retaliation began subtly. Petty notices arrived again, this time citing nonsense infractions. Unauthorized garden decor. Unapproved lighting adjustments. Disruptive yard symmetry. They piled up on my door like confetti after a parade, each more ridiculous than the last. They were not fines, not yet. Just warnings, paper reminders that the board had not forgiven and would not forget. But when those tactics failed to rattle me, they escalated. A dead patch of flowers appeared one morning, their roots poisoned. The solar lights were smashed in the night, glass shards scattered across the spirals of brick. Someone even tossed garbage bags into the lavender rows, leaving the air thick with rot. These were not accidents, they were messages, crude and venomous. I replaced what was broken, replanted what was lost, repaired what was damaged. Each act of vandalism became another entry in the growing dossier I kept. Photos, timestamps, witness accounts. Just as before, I documented everything. They had forgotten the lesson from court. I thrived on records, and their carelessness only armed me further. Then came their final mistake. The board, unable to break me through sabotage or threats, attempted to rewrite the rules themselves. At a closed-door session, they voted on sweeping amendments to the bylaws, clauses so specific, so absurd, they could only have been written with me in mind. They banned non-traditional landscaping, outlawed sculptural structures not approved by the board, and even prohibited the arrangement of bricks or stones in unconventional patterns. It was a tailor-made noose, designed to strangle my lawn into conformity, but power grabs done in secrecy rarely remain secret. A sympathetic neighbor on the board leaked the documents, sliding them into my mailbox late one evening with a note. They think this will stop you. Don't let them. I didn't plan my counterattack immediately. Instead, I waited, letting the board's arrogance ferment. They announced the new rules at a community meeting with self-satisfied grins, declaring the changes necessary for neighborhood harmony. But this time, the crowd was not with them. Murmurs spread through the room, faces twisted in doubt and anger. People remembered the court case, the testimonies, the humiliation. The board had overplayed its hand. That night, I launched the final strike. I released everything: the vandalism photos, the stack of petty notices, the leaked bylaws, and the full video of the board's closed-door session, secretly recorded by the same sympathetic neighbor. Every file, every clip, every piece of evidence hit the internet like a storm. Local reporters picked it up, bloggers amplified it, and soon the story spread far beyond our little subdivision. Headlines blared about a rogue HOA board rewriting rules to target a single homeowner. Social media burned with outrage. Commenters calling for resignations, investigations, even dissolution of the HOA itself. Within days, the pressure was unbearable. Homeowners flooded the board with demands for accountability, petitions circulated, and one by one, the board members began to resign. First the treasurer, then the secretary, then the smug vice president who had laughed when my notices piled up. Finally, the president, the self-proclaimed guardian of community standards, stepped down. His resignation letter leaked and ridiculed online. The HOA collapsed under its own weight, its bylaws suspended, its authority stripped. A temporary committee formed to manage the bare essentials, but the iron fist was gone, its claws dulled forever. And my lawn? It thrived. The spirals of brick gleamed in the sun, the lavender swayed in the breeze, the sculpture cast its strange shadows across the grass. Neighbors came not to complain but to admire, to walk the paths, to sit among the wildflowers and breathe in the scent of freedom. What had once been a battleground became a sanctuary, not just for me but for everyone tired of arbitrary rules and power games. I often thought back to the first letter taped to my door, the smug little note demanding conformity under threat of punishment. That was where it all began. One scrap of paper that sparked a war. They had tried to crush me with fines, shame, vandalism, and lawsuits, but in the end, it was their arrogance that destroyed them. The HOA had wanted to make me an example, a warning to others who might resist. And they succeeded, but not in the way they intended. My lawn became a symbol, a reminder that even the most rigid systems can be broken when someone refuses to bend. As the sun set one evening, casting gold across the spirals of brick, I stood at the edge of the yard and smiled. The battle was over. The board was gone. And my lawn, their so-called nightmare, was finally undeniably free. That night, I walked my lawn under the glow of the solar lights. The spirals of brick seemed sharper, the lavender richer, the wildflowers bolder. The yard was not just a garden. It was a battlefield, scarred but standing. I had faced the board in open conflict and prevailed. But as I gazed at the metallic sculpture casting fractured shadows across the grass, I realized the war was not over. The board had been embarrassed publicly, stripped of their victory in court. And men and women who live for power rarely retreat quietly. The final act was coming, the desperate retaliation of a defeated enemy. And when it came, I would be ready.